Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to the Adversity and Stars podcast. How my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. And remember, click that subscribe button, everybody. It's an amazing episode because Dr. Travis Langley has returned to the mothership. You know him as the writer of Batman and Psychology. He's now the editor and contributor to Stranger Things Psychology, Life Upside Down. Now come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Dr. Langley. Thank you so much for coming to the Adversity and Stars podcast.
Who, me?
It's an absolute honor to have you come back. It's always nice when someone returns.
How are you doing?
I'm doing so well, sir. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. I'm doing tired. Just did the first convention of the year down in New Orleans. And, well, New Orleans will make people tired, even aside from conventions.
How did that go?
Oh, very nicely. Really good. I've noticed for this past year, there's this extra energy of people going to conventions. I think they're just so glad to get out and about after, an extended period of lockdown.
Yes.
And having not had some of these conventions.
I would say the last time I went to the convention, the first one after COVID was over, there was a lot of people, and they definitely looked hungry. They'd been starving for a convention for years. They finally were allowed out to have some fun.
Yeah.
So what inspired? So you're the editor and writer of Stranger Things Psychology, Life Upside Down. So what inspired the creation of this book?
Well, the show and the love of the characters. I have been, this will be, if I don't count second editions, this will be book number 14.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because I started with Batman and Psychology, A Dark and Stormy Night, which I was the sole author on. And after it did well, other psychologists wanted to join me, and therapists of different kinds. And we've done a dozen, so Batman plus a dozen of those anthologies. And after the Joker Psychology, which we hit some dark stuff, I had to take a break. But thanks to lockdown, that 6-month break became a 2.5-year break. Well, my publisher had massive changes and layoffs, and I've actually gone back to the publisher for Batman because it had been a different publisher for all along. So I've gone back to the company that was publishing my Batman book. They've been they wanted some of these anthologies for a while anyway. And so Stranger Things Psychology is the first of the new anthologies with them. It's a bunch of our writers. We love the show Stranger Things. And the second will be Spider-Man Psychology Untangling Webs that comes out in May, but Stranger Things Psychology comes out next month. But you have a copy already, or at least the advanced copy, which does have a few errors. Like I was flipping through, it's like, how did we call that character by the wrong name? We know which character that is.
Oh, there's definitely a part where I think it's supposed to have a picture in it, but just says like image, image coming. I was like,
production.
It's also, probably not,
Also, in that review copy, most of the chapters images where there are images, they're on the wrong chapter.
Oh, really? I didn't even notice that.
Like the conspiracy board is not on Billy San Juan's conspiracy chapter. So those are some of the things that go through the production process, but it's cool to be able to have those physical advanced review copies. They are nice. There are plenty of books that I want to read on the computer or read on an iPad, but there are those that, especially when I'm marking stuff up and editing, or I might in the future, I like having the physical copy in hand. Like I've got a copy of Doctor Who Psychology from the first edition that on the side has said editing copy all along, because I always expected to do a second edition of that. And if we've got a second edition of Doctor Who Psychology coming out later this year, it hasn't been announced yet, but it would have a new subtitle. The first one, the subtitle was A Madman with a Box. That does not fit the most recent incarnation of the Doctor or the fugitive Doctor, the extra Doctor that was discovered along the way. So the subtitle would be Times Change. If there's one that a second edition that comes out in time for the 60th anniversary.
And if you want to come back on the show and talk about it, that's okay too. This book that may or may not exist in the future.
The Stranger Things is, where you get into one of these shows or the movies, it's about the love of the characters. That's why we stay with it. It's not just about the monsters, it's about the humanity in these. There are sometimes when somebody will ask me, "Oh, would you ever write about such and such?" It's like, I don't see enough depth in that topic. But Stranger Things is easy to see. So you got the nostalgia, you've got the trauma. Of course, every book I do has trauma. It's just a matter of what do we say different about trauma itself, not just the situations they're going through. And these characters have repeated traumas. Well, they have one every few months by their time. It's we know that there's going to be a time jump before the last season, story wise, because of lockdown and the kids aging.
Mm.
It's I strongly suspect, based on where the characters are in time, if the showrunners had been able to stick to their original plan, odds are Chernobyl would have tied into season 5. But since they're going to do a time jump, even if they do, it won't be done the same way. Of course, one character's fate, and maybe one character's in an extended nap at the end of season 4 because of that time jump, or nap's going to be a whole lot longer than it would have been.
True. So when you're determining with the contributors that you have in the book, when you're determining which parts of the book they're going to contribute to, are you thinking of which aspects you agree with, or just which contributors you want to hear from?
Oh, it does not have to be which aspects I agree with.
Okay.
It's once in a while there will be one I'll say, no, we are not doing that in here. Way back when we did Game of Thrones psychology, there was a psychologist who wanted to do a chapter looking at the incestuous relationship between Cersei and her brother. But then I get it, and it's like it's almost pro incest. It's like, no, no, we're not doing that. I'm not having my name on a damn book with a pro incest chapter. There's a cultural. It's like, no, we're not doing this. So there are some points at which no, I'm going to disagree, and or if somebody has something that is kind of fringe or questionable, I may bring in somebody else to offer a counterpoint. Yes, because I think one of the really important things with these anthologies is that it's not all who agrees with me or who will say the things that I would say myself if I had the time to just write the book. I think the variety of perspectives is important. But there are those. Well, for example, with a Freudian, a whole lot of Freud's ideas aren't supported by empirical science. So I'm having to encourage him to, okay, gotta add some qualifiers, like add and according to Freud on this sentence. Don't just state this as a fact. It's like we got to throw in according to Freud. We've got to acknowledge, when there's not the empirical evidence to back up. Now, to be fair to Freud did not trust the empirical science of the time, and there were some good reasons for that. But it's like, so there these go through, but when we're choosing the original topic, it's what interests me, the topic for the book, what interests me, what interests other people who would contribute to it, and then what will the publisher let us do. And that has a lot of things go into that. In terms of the topics that are in the book, like let's say with Stranger Things, there's some things that it looks to me, okay, there's some things we've got to hit. We've got to hit somebody with a friendship. That's so important in here. We need somebody to, and then not just the psychological topic. We got to talk about Dungeons and Dragons in the book.
Yeah,
we've got to somehow, and so I'll ask the people who regularly contribute. I'll start by asking them, okay, what would any of you like to contribute to this? And I'll see which of them do, and who. There was one for Spider-Man where I just told somebody I just don't see how that would fit. And I think we've got better things to talk about. We've got so many topics with Spider-Man. But I'll say what fits, and then I'll look at what seems to be missing for the things they've brought up. And then either, okay, for something that looks like it's missing, is that something I would want to write about? Or I think I can recruit somebody who would. So yeah, I want to make sure we've got somebody different every time, but not in the case of Stranger Things. I did not go recruiting new writers because none of us are making money on this one. We're donating all the money, and the plan is for it to go to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. It's but as we're wording it, what if the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has some major scandal as some other charities have? Right. So all we're putting in print and all I'm committing to definitely is that it's going to nonprofit to support recovering missing children and supporting those who've been exploited, or supporting those who've been missing because they've odds are they've been exploited, when missing. But it's all we've always wanted to have some that would go purely to nonprofit organization. This one seemed like the absolute right book to do it. But I had so many people who had things they wanted to say on Stranger Things. I actually don't write all that much in the book this time because we had so many people who wanted. Eric Wesselman might be the only one who's worked on two different chapters in the book. An early one, and then he also did a co-author. He co-authored with two different people in there, and except for Eric, I think maybe one other person where there's a note so and so's bio appears over and such point. Just a lot of people wanted to have things they wanted to say. With Spider-Man, I read a lot in that book. I think authored or co-authored 4 chapters and lots of features plus introductions and all this other stuff. And I have learned over time I kind of have to with comic book related topics because so many of our regular contributors, their comic book knowledge is not as in depth as their movie or TV knowledge. And people going into those kind of books, they want to know that you have a broader knowledge. With something like Stranger Things, it's specific, and we don't have to pull in from there are Stranger Things novels and comic books and games, and we don't have to pull from those because we've got more than enough to say about the source material. There is room if somebody had a point to really make about that. Back in the Star Wars book, I had somebody who was pulling from a game manual because he had something specific to say about Lando Calrissian that did let him talk about a psychological topic that nothing from the movies would have let him talk about. It's like, okay, because otherwise, stick to the source material because more readers are going to know that
right
stuff.
So one interesting thing in reading the book is that there's at least one part that I noticed a kind of an interesting contradiction. It felt like in the in the larger chapter. So I kind of want to discuss your thoughts on it. Had to do with
our writers can contradict each other.
Yeah, it had to do with nostalgia and the value of it. In one part, it discussed the importance of nostalgia as a way to help against anxiety. In another part, they said nostalgia is a sign of homesickness type sadness.
Well,
So
that was the original meaning of nostalgia. Nostalgia was originally thought of as a mental illness. The word nostalgia referred to a mental that thought was thought of as a mental illness for being emotionally stuck in the past, and that can be a bad thing. People who are anxious are more likely to dwell on the future. People who are depressed are more likely to dwell on the past. Now, those are just tendencies. There are valuable lessons from the past. There's a comfort in the past. It's a matter of when do you need comfort to help you get through things? When do you need comfort to help you survive? But when do you also need to escape your comfort, get out of your comfort zone, so you're not just sitting in the chair all day? And there can be a fine line there, and it can even sound contradictory. It's like sometimes you need to sit there and relax. Sometimes you need to get off your butt and go do stuff.
That's true. And I mean, the interesting thing is when we're talking about nostalgia, especially in a show like Stranger Things, is that look into because Stranger Things, one of the main part of it is that it kind of represents our youth, especially those who grew up in the 80s, things of that nature. Is that then a positive aspect of for viewers to go back to that nostalgia aspect, or is that kind of wish fulfillment for things that we did not fulfill in adult or whatever you want to phrase it?
Well, for people who they spend their days wearing, I never got to fight at Emmett. I never got to fight, Russian agents. It's if you're dwelling on that, well, that's an unrealistic thing to dwell on. It's are you dwelling on counterfactual thinking? If only the present were different than it really is now, or if only my past had been different. Well, it can't be. But there are getting you to think about your past can be useful. Sometimes it's a reminder that it's like, oh yeah, there were those unpleasant times when I got bullied as a kid, and I wish I'd done these other things, but I'm better now. Sometimes looking at that stuff can make you feel better about where you are, or reconsider where you're going, or sometimes adults seem to forget that they were kids when they're talking to kids, and it's a good reminder. It's like, you did worse than what they're doing. So something like this, it appeals not just to those who were kids in the 80s, but to those who are kids now. So there are some universal experiences, and then there are differences, but the thing is fantastic to begin with. um, and of course, in terms of storytelling, when there are some horror elements, they by making it a period piece, you automatically get around the cell phone issue.
Mm.
Every horror story now has to deal with the cell phone issue. And it's like, oh, we're in a dead zone. Like, yeah, I'm going to collect all your phones so that we got this weekend without, somebody stole all our phones.
Yeah.
So they all, then some make them part of the story, but you always have to deal with the cell phone issue in modern horror stories. It's not an issue at all. You've got the four different dyads or triads, little groups of them, off on having their own adventures, and it's a while before they find out, our buddies have been having an adventure too. And
Yeah.
they finally share information in the next to last episode, and pull together for the finale.
Now, when you're another part of the book that's kind of interesting, I'm kind of wondering if it connects to nostalgia. You're talking, you mentioned in the book the idea of parasocial relationships that are formed between the viewer and in the fictional characters that we're watching and being entertained by. Now, is there a line between that and nostalgia then, where is it the characters, or it reminds you of the incident where you watched it before, or things of that nature?
Oh, there is nostalgia for characters and stories that were appealing to you in your childhood. And sometimes we need to be reminded. It's like, oh yeah, I've forgotten how much I enjoyed that back then, and I can enjoy it now too. There's what you call your comfort shows,
Mm-hmm.
and man, did people fall back on those during lockdown. A
Yes.
lot. And it varies. For some people, it was shows they'd already seen and knew well. They rewatched them. Some it was the stuff from their childhood. Me, it was British mystery and thriller series that I had not seen before for the most part. Although I did rewatch Breaking Bad, but I was doing that about once a year until the Better Call Saul finale, and now it's finished. It's complete. So, uh, that's there is the comfort, but for those who don't know, what do you mean by parasocial relationship? A parasocial relationship is a one-sided social like connection that feels like a relationship where there's something meaningful about somebody who cannot reciprocate, or is almost certainly not going to reciprocate. Obviously, a fictional character, cannot have feelings about you. Celebrities, news figures, there are different ways of having these, but they can be very meaningful and important to you. It can affect your self-esteem. You find out somebody you admired as a hero, a Tour de France bicyclist winner champion got caught doping, got caught having trying to ruin the lives of some people who once were going to out him.
Mm.
It's that hurts. It hurts your self-esteem. If it happens with a fictional character, you can go, it's like, well, that's not my version of Batman. That's
Mm.
not, it's like, okay, the writer this season on there, they don't know what they're doing. It's a little hard when they've had the same writers over the entire thing with Stranger Things, but so many other things have a lot of different writers and contributors. And it's like, oh, that's not my season one, version of Lucas, who spoke to me the way this season 4 Lucas does not.
Right.
But that's different with somebody like, say I were talking about a guy whose name rhymes with Lance Armstrong. It's you can't really go, that's not my Lance. It's say it ain't so, Joe. It's like they do the things they do. It's in some ways easier and less shattering to your self-image when it is fictional characters, that's because they're stories. You don't have to worry when the flaws go in. It's You can ignore them in a way that with real people, that might be a bad thing to overlook their flaws, but they are human beings. But it's meaningful. Not a lot of actual empirical research has been done. Some of the earliest writings on it assumed it was a bad thing, but what research has been done since then generally has shown that no, it seems to be part of healthy, normal process for people. We learn from stories our whole lives. You learn from fictional characters when you were little kids. You learn things about cooperation and counting and going the hell to sleep.
Is that why some viewers, not all, but some viewers have difficulty separating the character from the actor?
Yeah, it's but I mean the actor is a person who's doing a job, and it is some some individuals are very unfair to actors. It's like they're not their characters.
Mm.
There is on that the reboot of that 70s show, that 90s show.
Mm.
They've got everybody except one particular actor who has some charges against him, and I hope that it so that, but for the sake of but the character does not deserve to have some terrible thing having happened to him, because he was part of the nostalgia of that. The whole show's nostalgia that ties into this. It's I hope they just say something like, you know, Hyde's living off the grid, and Red is like, what? It's like, Eric, Dad, it's in his name. Hyde. He's trying to. He's just staying off the grid. It's a simple way to account for why there's nothing with that character, because the character does what the character deserves. Character doesn't deserve anything. He's not real. But our character, our
Mm.
relationship with that character. Why do people argue who shot first in a particular scene? And you know what scene I'm talking about. All I said was who shot first on a movie that we're not talking about at the moment, that we did before the recording. But um, with these characters, when the characters feel like they're being untrue, like Hopper is the one that people in particular will harp on all the changes in Hopper, but people are chaotic. You know, he's got strength, he's got heroism, he's got ways in which he cares people. He's also full of all kinds of lessons of toxic masculinity that he'd been learning throughout his entire life. And it's we have examples of positive masculinity in Joe's character and Steve and Bob and Mr. Clark. You know, these individuals, because Steve had to show some growth early on, and really a lot of that has to do with the actor. And of course, Bob was supposed to die in just 3 episodes, but they just said, "Oh, we like him. We're going to keep him around longer." But these are examples of more positive people who aren't buying into the toxic masculinity. Steve had to move past it a little in season 1, but he did. And you've got some very toxic individuals in there. And then there's Hopper. It's getting into the individual who's gone through these things. He makes some progress. He has some setbacks, but that's very human. It's not an all or nothing. It's like, okay, now we're gonna be the best person he can be. So I think it's fascinating when people um love Hopper or get annoyed with Hopper. It's like, I don't like Hopper this season. Oh, why is he being so mean? It's like, because he's still got things to learn. He still has to grow and will his entire life.
What does it say about the viewer that we expect ourselves to grow? We expect people that we know to grow. We don't expect the characters to grow.
Yeah. Well, the characters, they exist outside time for us. The season 1 version of the character is just as real as the season 4 version of the character. That
Mm.
season 1 story still exists no matter what happens later on. And that can be what we love. That's what we loved then, and we don't want to give up what we loved then, so we're going back to that one.
It kind of reminds me of some other shows. We talked about a franchise before that we're not going to discuss, where a character is revisited in many ways. Was it 40 years later? And people were very unhappy with how the character appeared in that movie, in the second sequel of the movie series we're not going to talk about. It feels like people not only get bothered by changes, but are actually personally offended when a character does make a significant change in how they're written.
Did you see the revival special for Rocco's Modern Life?
I have not.
They address that whole topic. It
Oh, really?
gets into the whole thing. It becomes central to the story. Because here are the characters, they've been floating off in space for years, and then they land back on Earth, like their house had been accident. At the end of the last episode, they accidentally get the house fired out into space, and then they land, and they get into this issue of nostalgia and people not wanting their characters to change and grow. But if they're truly alive, there's change. If you are stagnant, you're not really alive. There's a point at which, with at which, okay, if they're exactly the same as they've always been, there's there is this lack of life to them.
All right, so let's talk about Dungeons and Dragons, which has become ubiquitous with Stranger Things, and they're so well connected. Why has that game become such a great allegory for social interactions and how, especially young people, learn to build friendships and learn how to maybe even cope with their own strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah, my best friends in high school, we all played D&D. It was a very important way for opening social avenues for people who didn't necessarily have some others. Maybe connecting with people who were in groups that you never would have connected with otherwise. Dungeons and Dragons, it both lets people escape from the world into their fantasy world, but also can enhance the world that they're in, because you are doing these things with other people. It is a social activity no matter what. If it's not a social activity, it's not Dungeons and Dragons. It is, and it is creative. It's as creative as you want to be, though you need somebody in the room to be creative. It is it the show, after the opening scene, the series begins with Dungeons and Dragons. After that, after the opening scene at the lab, the kids are in the basement playing D&D. And Will ends up saying, he got caught by the Demogorgon, and then he gets caught by the creature that they will name Demogorgon. And the whole thing becomes, it gives them language to talk about these strange experiences that we have, because we need language. We put labels on things. You ever watch any of these TV shows or movies where they don't give a name to the people with superpowers? People with abilities? No, people make up words. People will make up words because we need language for what we're talking about.
Right.
That's why the majority of our diagnostic terms exist, just so that we have a clue that we're all talking about the same thing or not. And we'll still argue about the words. Likewise with these characters, they're going into something so bizarre. Adolescence, but even aside from that, they're going into the bizarreness of monsters. The chaos of the monsters, the chaos of everything they're going through, is its own analogy for the chaos of adolescence, chaos of puberty for them. And it's difficult. It's difficult to talk. It's difficult for the adolescent kid to talk about what they're going through. And it's easier now in some ways, because not just sharing with strangers through social media, but there are a lot of topics people will talk about now that they wouldn't have talked about in the 80s. In the 80s, it would be nice to have found out that, everybody else feels alone and isolated in some way or another. Almost everybody. Everybody else feels weird and self-conscious. These adolescent kids who don't realize that other people are feeling these things too, and that's a very important lesson. And oddly enough, something that forces an emotional kind of interaction such as Dungeons and Dragons is a way to discover some of the things about what your peers are feeling. There's a lot of value. That's another one where some of those earliest writings, the few psychologists who are addressing it, were writing about, here are all the horrible things that can happen, and the evidence is showing it's like, nope, you're wrong. They just are. In fact, there's a lot of therapeutic value. There are plenty of therapists who use it in therapeutic context.
Because you mentioned it in the book, it's mentioned in the book, and it's also mentioned in the show. As you mentioned, the idea that Dungeons and Dragons had, for a while, especially in the 80s, a view that was satanic, which is very similar to how people view comic books in the 50s. So why do you think that anything that's become a certain level of popularity among youth, become demonized very quickly by certain segments of the population?
It's Scott Jordan talked a lot about that in the book, and I was so glad he did. Of course, Ben Stover, he talked about the thing that you were asking me about that I didn't have the answer on, and I co-authored that with him, I know, but he wrote the chapter, and then I turned into something that fit the rest of the book. Most of the ideas in there are his. The Scott's chapter, it's he wanted to add, especially this thing with what happened to Eddie, because we'd written a full set of chapters before season 4. For the schedule that we were following. And I was like, okay, but we absolutely have to, if the book's not coming out till after season 4, we absolutely have to talk about season 4. So some of the chapters changed a little, some changed a lot. and Scott added this thing about Dungeons and Dragons and the satanic panic over it as a feature, on his chapter. And there were people demonizing the game. There's Rona, what's her face? I do remember the name, but Rona what's her face? That's her name now. With her mazes and monsters thing based on this myth about this guy having gotten lost in the game, and Tom Hanks played it in the movie, and it was just people had these bizarre, fantastic ideas about D&D. I remember a friend of mine, the one who introduced me to Dungeons and Dragons. His girlfriend was the daughter of a minister. I won't name the denomination, but I found out her dad preached an anti D&D sermon one day. It's like, well, that's going to be because her daughter's dating the guy who introduced some of the rest of us to D&D. They had these ideas, and role playing can be a powerful thing. Role playing can train all kinds of unhealthy behaviors, but most of the evidence is like it's not doing as much of what people assume it would. It's people who play Dungeons and Dragons. They don't run around stabbing people with swords.
Believe it or not.
Believe it or not, it's like you brought up the scapegoat issue. You didn't use the word, but that's what you were talking about.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, comic books were a scapegoat for the increase in juvenile delinquency after World War II. Frederick Wortham being the loudest voice on that, or rock and roll music, rap music, video games. Repeatedly, people are looking for a scapegoat, something they can blame for what's going on, especially what's going on with those youth. What's different for them as opposed to, well, when we listened to rock and roll music when we were kids, we were fine, but they're listening to rap, and on and on. It's looking for something to blame instead of taking full responsibility for teaching people the moral. If you're worried about people not behaving morally, say talk to your kids, interact with your kids to begin with, and try to figure out like, what do you do about it after the fact. People will always look for scapegoats, and it will be especially something that's popular with younger individuals, more popular with younger individuals than with older individuals, because then those loud older individuals who have some money and resources to gripe about it can be the one to do some blaming.
Now, in Stranger Things, the example that's often used is Eddie.
Yeah.
It seemed like at some points in the story he began to, at least a little bit, absorb that feeling the scapegoat that people was seeing as negative into his own personality. That he felt that maybe something's wrong with him based on this. Is that something that does occur, and what is done about that?
Well, with Eddie, he feels bad because he feels he's learned that he's a coward. He was in a bizarre situation. It's what, run into the hole in the top of the room? It's like there's absolutely nothing you can do about that. The fight or flight response had better give you the flight direction and get away from it. But he's repeatedly seeing these things that just make him think, yeah, that's what I've learned. I'm a coward. That's when it has to do with self-preservation. But when it comes to somebody else, he overcomes it. When it's about somebody else, like he couldn't do anything for the cheerleader who was up in the air. But when it is about somebody that he has a chance to do something for, he does not take that coward's way, and he's consciously making himself overcome that flight impulse. So he's got a lot of strengths, and even as rudely as he talks to some of the kids early on, you really get to paying attention. He is taking the shepherding role. He is trying to, help them have a better experience in high school, especially there at the end when he's telling Dusty to look out for the other sheep. That speaks very strongly about his character and his genuine concern and empathy for other people.
Because it one part I think was interesting about Stranger Things because once again he does kind of seem to internalize on some level the view of the society when they turn on him as being the killer. Everyone views him as killer. He kind of internalizes that just a little bit as far as the negativity the world feels about the ostracism that he begins to feel from that.
I remember when it hit me that they're doing Damien Nichols, they're doing the West Memphis 3. This was before I'd read about it online, but Memphis is not that far from here.
Mm,
And I knew Damien Eccles' lawyer. He spoke to my class one time. So there may be some reasons I would recognize it faster than some people would. But I remember when it hit me, it's like, oh, they are blatantly pulling from some of the terrible things that happened to these guys who got called in to the police for no reason other than being the weird kids.
mm,
For being in the goth kids and so forth, and these guys spent many years in prison when there had been not a shred of evidence against them.
mm.
And it is a terrible thing. And Eddie doesn't get an easy out on that either,
Eh,
because life has unpleasant, terrible things in it.
and I think that's the interesting part is that they I don't know if it doesn't show goes and gloss over, but the fact that he goes through that turmoil, he goes through the sacrifice and everything else, he's still just a kid. He whether or not the situations he's been through as an adult, even though he's almost out of high school, he's still just a child going through this heavy stuff with the
Mm-hmm.
society turning him. And I feel like that was almost they didn't hit on that as much as they could have. That even though yeah, it's bad, but keep in mind he's bad that we're doing it to a kid.
Yeah. Although a third year senior, so he's 19 or
Yeah,
it's,
on some
and
levels.
he's a drug dealer. Yeah, but he's the one we feel for. Even those other things. Okay, the selling drugs is that he's expressing concern for this cheerleader. It's like he wants to make sure. It's like, is this really something you should be doing? It's like, that's not your normal drug dealer behavior.
But I think another aspect of Dungeons and Dragons that was kind of interesting, and I kind of
Mhm.
feel was important that they explored it, is with Will Byers. Not necessarily the sexuality aspect, but the fact that he's with friends that matured sexually quicker and that he was able to not catch up with them. And I think it was an interesting thing to have in a show that kind of does tell kids, because I think that is real. You're not gonna that everyone
Mhm.
does not grow at this mature at the same
Right.
pace, and
Yeah,
how
there are there,
impactful.
there are there are those who take an interest in dating later than their peers. And I remember, um like with my friends in high school, on Dungeons and Dragons, if somebody had a date, it was just kind of agreed among us as, oh, sure, no big deal, no, we're not doing D&D that night. But I do
Yeah.
remember one guy was joining us later. He was baffled by somebody. I was like, no, no, no. It's like, so if anybody in this group gets a day, it's like we let them. But I remember, but that one who was actually, this guy was in college and he had trouble understanding somebody going on a date instead of playing D&D. But I also think he was young. He was young for his age. I think he came into college. He must have been younger than the rest of us, even because so when I saw him after college, he had grown taller after college, and it's like, oh, he must have been at a younger age. But for whatever reason, he was behind the rest of us in terms of maturation, and he had trouble with that idea. So some people just develop at different rate. People who've gone through something traumatic, and there does happen where there are things to interfere with people's lives, like say lockdown interferes with some of what would have been normal social development, because that happens to all of them
Mm.
going through that. A friend of my kids, he missed a year of school because of a physical injury that he'd had. And so there are people who miss out on life events. There are people who go through traumas. There are those who just develop later than others, regardless of what the reason is. Even that's a separate issue from Will's actual sexual orientation. And yeah, when there's the one who is not into these things and their friends are, yeah, they can feel lost behind. The one who is, oh, my, your friends are not interested in playing with the toys that you used to be interested in. You still want to, and maybe you play with younger kids for a little while. It's yeah. What do they do? Where do they go? And then the separate issue of Will's actual sexual orientation, um, which, okay, it is. And I mean, Noah Schnapp, although he came out recently, but the actor who plays Will, he has said in the most recent season they've played it out right. It's like clearly he has his attraction to his best friend, and it's breaking his heart. But he is genuinely Mike's friend, and he wants Mike to be happy, and he knows Mike is he knows Mike is not gay, and But I know there were a lot of individuals, a lot of asexual individuals who were kind of bothered by that. But your romantic interest and your sexual interest can be two different things.
Mm.
He could be gay but asexual, which it was a hard. I was having to explain this. I was having to explain this to another psychologist recently, who had not heard of the terms homoromantic or heteroromantic, which is a feature I wrote in the book. Um, you could have individuals who have no interest whatsoever in sex. They are asexual or ace, as many will call themselves. Um, and it may be just a difference in physiological. Who knows why? And there's nothing wrong with that. But they may want a relationship. They may want a partner in life, and something more intimate than just a best buddy.
Mm.
So he could be, he will, as far as we know, by the end of season 4, could be asexual while also being homoromantic. It's like wanting an intimate relationship with another guy if he were to have one, because asexual individuals, most of them don't want to be alone.
Mm. Now, there's also that scene that it's somewhat of a famous moment where he's in the car crying, but well, not face,
Oh,
away,
yeah.
away from Mike. Now, is that crying because he sees his friend with somebody else that he cares about, or is it because he sees a friend drifting further from him?
Oh, he feels all those things. He has felt his friends drifting from him. That's been with him for a while. But this particular scene, especially the way Noah played it, that is very much about his own actual attraction to Mike, which he's got all these feelings. You see glimpses of it here and there, where they don't say it outright, but there are all these things that sure look like Will worries about being alone.
Mm.
And he's been isolated from people. He's been separated even from his friends. There are these distances. The moment when it's like when Jonathan saw the crying in the rearview mirror, and Jonathan very wisely makes a point of telling him, being reassuring to him at a very important time, and that's a good idea. You don't, if you see somebody going through something in their lives, if you don't understand what it is, or you do know what it is, but it's not your place necessarily to say, hey, I know you're going through this, if they haven't told you themselves. But
Mm.
it still can be very important to give them reassurance that they accept you and regard you positively, no matter what. It goes into that client-centered therapy, or person-centered therapy, as more modern called. Where really important things is for the therapist to show unconditional positive regard for a person. The
Mm.
people in your life, you definitely need to know that there are people that no matter what you tell them, they're going to love and accept you regardless.
So once it's understood by his friends that he obviously has not matured in the same sexually in the same way that they are, at least up to their speed,
Yeah.
are they handling it? You know what I'm saying? Are they doing it the right way in how they're treating
His
their
friends don't
friend?
know what they're doing. They don't know
Okay.
what they're doing. um it's the few times that ever kind of address, a couple of them say things that are a little too strong, and they'll back off and apologize. For the most part, they don't address it. And okay, that's a pretty common thing too.
Hmm.
um it's these are friends. Well, Robin has not come out to anybody else except Steve.
Hmm.
And she says outright in season 4 she thinks she'll be the town pariah if she makes a pass at the wrong person.
Hmm.
Back when she has this coming out scene with Steve, right after she has said her thing and we're waiting for Steve's answer. Watch that scene again while we're looking at him. I didn't catch it the first time through. Look at her face. Her head is hanging there while we're waiting for Steve's answer. She has this look on her face like she feels she has just ruined everything.
Hmm.
It's a really interesting look on her face. Maya Hawke does a fantastic job with that character, and but she has told Steve because she feels she has to. And okay, he has his one for a moment to even understand what she just said, but then okay, hits it and takes it on, and then he starts kidding her a buddy to show absolutely he's accepting her. Okay, they can't be a couple. He is still absolutely her friend, and from then on, she's his best friend.
Is there a space for Robin and Will to have a moment together in season 5, you think? Because they are similarly dealing with something that you think they could understand each other.
It makes sense. It almost makes too much sense. Oh well, they're these two gay characters, so they've got to buddy up. But they have both gone through these things, and it Will does need to hear from somebody else. And in real life, anybody knows people who've already gone through some
Right.
of the things they've gone through. For the most part, neither one is like Jonathan knows about Will. Of course, other kids have made jokes calling him fairy and things along the way. So other kids had picked up along the way. And Steve knows about Robin. Odds are she'll have a girlfriend before the next season, but she still hasn't come out to the one she's interested in, who seems like she's going to be her girlfriend. It's so they've got a lot to do. Is how do you happen to open up to this person? The Robin doesn't even particularly know Will.
True, true.
Yeah.
Because it just seems like a mentor that's needed and a mentor is there. It seems like a moment that's missed.
But she hasn't been there. As she barely met Will when his family moved,
Mm,
and they just got back, and she wasn't there when he got back. She has barely ever even met Will.
good point. Yeah, there's also a quote in the book that I kind of want to go over a little bit as well that kind of covers this. We're talking about ostracism, and it
Mm-hmm.
states that some data suggests that being completely ignored hurts worse than direct negative attention. So
Yeah.
why is that, and how damaging has that been for like someone like Will in the story?
Well, attention is still attention. There are kids who will do things to get punished because it's the only attention they get. Most of us have a strong need for some kind of human interaction. Somebody giving you negative attention is still showing enough interest in you to do that, whatever it is they're doing.
Okay.
Being ignored can be harder, especially if you're white. There are people you would wish ignored you, but if it's an ongoing wide thing, if your parents are ignoring you, there's nothing to work with. There's no fences to mend. It's that's kind of like what we refer to as a negative symptom with mental illness. The positive symptoms, where something's added to behavior, you can work with. You maybe shape it into something else. At least the person who's you know arguing with you is talking with you, and maybe something can change. But if they're just not talking, if one of those dads never says anything useful around anybody except some meaningless platitudes here and there, he would be the hardest for anybody to get anything useful out of ever, out
Mm.
of all the characters on the show. Elle has gotten more kindness from Papa, of all people, than the Wheeler kids have gotten from their dad.
Good point. So for all these characters that are dealing with stuff like that in the story, how damaging? I mean, is that how much trauma does that cause?
Okay, that's how much trauma. We don't have a scale though, so
So
never
so
try to go on that
how are they? I'm trying to think of a better way of phrasing it. Is that has that been impactful for how their interaction with each other has maybe evolved because of how they're dealing with those outside that circle who may be ostracizing them?
You get regularly ostracized, regularly cut off from others. You expect rejection, and that can interfere with accepting positive attention when it's coming. Max is too ready to cut people off, and that could have to do with she hasn't been ostracized the same way, but she hasn't made a bunch of friends outside this same little crew along the way.
Mm,
So she's there is this distance between her and others, and there is this readiness. She's got this greater readiness to cut people off, and that would suggest that she's had some past ostracism as well. If people are regularly rejecting you, like say you ask person after person to go to the movies with you and nobody says yes, after a while it just hurts to ask at all.
mm,
And so that's going to create Dustin, he's bold and he'll ask, but he finds the people who will say yes. He gets a lot of no's, and he may be crying at the end of the dance, but he has enough confidence or persistence to keep trying things. But so he's gotten support in some places. He even with his mom and how she's spoiling him, it's okay. That's not the best of behavior either, but it is encouraging more useful behavior than the Wheeler's dad does.
Yeah, I mean, and thinking about how people are treated, like the bully scenes with Elle in season 4, especially when she eventually bashes a girl with the ice skate, it's handled in one way, but I will say as a
That's
viewer,
a horrible thing she did. She maimed a person. And I think that deserves more less sympathy than some people are giving it. People going, yeah, it's like, no, somebody's calling you names. Somebody, okay, what that other good girl did to her was horrible. Yes. But you don't respond. This is how we wind up with people who go on shooting sprees against the popular kids. She deserves some consequences for hitting a mean girl, wounding her in the face with an ice skate.
I get that. I thought someone who had been bullied. Part of me was thinking, I didn't mind that much,
Yeah, see there,
unfortunately.
that's the thing that that's the thing we're ready to feel. It's like, yeah, she was bullying her. It's like, but it was a different kind of bullying.
So
In real life, if somebody was picking on somebody else, and somebody scars them across the face, the one who does the scarring is looking at jail time.
I will agree with that part of
Yeah.
it. But with the Duffer
Although Elle's
brothers,
grown up in jail time.
so when you're looking about the Duffer brothers, do you think their intention was to show the ugliness of that, or do you think they're looking at from a geek perspective, who would be the bullied kids who are going,
Oh, they're looking
yeah,
at the perspective from the bullied kids. Yeah.
yeah? Because I know there's a moment where they do it, go far enough to show the horror that Mike is seeing as when he sees it, some of the others around him. So
Yeah.
were they at least kind of leaning towards this is such a horrible thing, or say, as I can see both sides of that a little bit. Unfortunately, probably more than I should. Unfortunately, I know you're trying time. Just want to go to a couple more, one more or two more questions. That's it. Two more questions. Uh, the primary one is looking at Vecna.
Okay.
Um, Once again, he is obviously a cause. He has become the center point for all the trauma in Stranger Things, because he's and he's the center bad guy in season 4. Is he
Mhm.
also a product then of trauma as well? The character who guy becomes Vecna.
Well, I mean, you're shaped by any trauma you go through, but people will also make assumptions that, oh, you've gone through trauma, therefore it explains this. No, he seems like he was going to be a terrible person to begin with. Elle went through that stuff too. It's he's a terrible person. He was terrible as a child before the traumatic things happened, and so because the earlier somebody becomes all powerful, okay, how can anybody become a good person if they get those powers early on? You have some stray thought, but it seems to be pretty clearly written that no, he was born bad. He was a bad seed. He was terrible even before he had these powers. As far as we know, he's doing cruel things to animals. They're trying to make sure to throw in as many of the signs to communicate very strongly. He was bad before trauma. He was bad before things happen, and to him, the biggest trauma was the disappointment that he didn't do even more to his own family.
Hmm. From a psychological standpoint, is there such thing as a born bad person?
Depends on who you ask and how much we're going to argue over it. It's, I believe yes, and there'll
Okay.
be a whole lot of people who tell me I'm full of crap.
Okay.
It's just there are people who do seem to be we'll go with we'll fit with the empirical evidence. There are people who do seem to be born to be psychopaths. Now, not all psychopaths become monsters. You could have no empathy for anybody else, but still find you can find practical reasons for not violating norms. You can find socially useful directions for that. So that's where it gets a bit trickier. But yeah, but
At least,
we're starting to get we're moving outside the range of what can really be confirmed in terms of empirical evidence. So you can't do research to find out, oh, if we manipulate this, let's see how many of them become bad. It all has to be done after the fact, and there's so many other variables in our lives that we can't really know for certain. You start to get more philosophical than psychological once we go to that question of are there those who are born bad? The behaviorists will believe no. There'll be plenty of others who believe no. Um, it's I think some are, but
I mean, it kind of in my head, it kind of goes back to in the old idea from any writer's standpoint, where every villain's a hero in their own mind on some level. And the reason I'm bringing that part up is this: is it the idea that they're inherently being intentionally, being bad, or is there something psychologically missing that they're not able to realize what they're doing?
well, if we're talking about psychopaths, yeah, there is something missing, so they don't really realize. There are other individuals though. There are plenty of other things with reasons people could have where there's something is different about them, something where they haven't had the same kind of feeling as other people. That doesn't make them bad in and of itself. If we're talking about psychopaths, they are missing empathy. They don't understand it. They might be, some will fake it, some will be able to fake it. It's part of why group therapy is a terrible thing, because they'll learn more from the group therapy. Oh, this is what they want to hear me say. All right, I'll do that. But when Vecna says he had decided to become a predator for good. Okay, so that's in his head. I don't see any evidence of you doing any good, dude, but it's in his head that he would become a predator for good. So somehow he believed he would try to accomplish something good, his concept of it, but he does not understand, even with his psychic abilities, he does not understand the same feelings other people have.
Now, as they discuss the psychic, is it the ability to truly understand people's psychology, or is just a look at it? Like, is he able to understand what he's seeing? Like, if he does have the ability to see the thoughts of others, does that make sense?
You can see how people are acting and not understand it. You can hear everything somebody says and not understand it. So of course you can perceive somebody else's thoughts and still not know what they're feeling. There's nothing to indicate there's anything empathetic about him, whether we're talking basic real world empathy or psychic empathy. There's nothing to indicate that he's picking up on the feelings of others. He's playing on the worst of everything. He's not play. It's like what you see with some other individuals where they play on people's fear, they play on anger. He especially is playing on the fear, and he's playing, oh man, is he playing on people's guilt. His victims are people who have guilt over some big batches of survivor guilt. He's playing on these worst qualities because he has learned to recognize some of those, but he's not playing on the better qualities of people. He's not using temptation. He's not using tempting them with things with love and friendship, even though he tells Elle, oh, I thought I'd have you by my side. It's like, no, he doesn't.
I mean, is it a form of projection because he has so many bad aspects? He just assumes everyone is him.
That's, yeah, it's definitely, if you're going with the Freudian kind of argument, and in our own frame of reference, we assume the kind of things we think and feel are more common in other people than they necessarily are. There will be that, but it's like, if you don't know something, of course you've got to use your own mind to begin with as a frame of reference for trying to figure anybody else out.
Well, Dr. Lang, I want to thank you so much for talking with me. But first things first, when can our listeners find Stranger Things Psychology, and obviously what's next is hopefully Spider-Man?
Stranger Things Psychology, Life Upside Down, comes out at the end of February. Amazon, Barnes and Noble's always been really good about carrying these books, but it'll be all over the place. At the end of May, Spider-Man Psychology, Untangling Web. So right before the next Spider-Verse movie, I wanted to do Spider-Man for so long. Thanks to No Way Home and Spider-Verse, the publisher finally lets me. And then later in the year, hey, I wonder if we'll be doing something about Doctor Who. But so after the 2.5 year, although I did a second edition of Batman and Psychology during the break, but in terms of the anthologies, we had a 2.5 year break. And then we've got 3 for this year. And it's that, and I'm easy to find on social media. Just look for Travis Langley. I'm almost certainly the one you'll find.
Well, I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Langley, for coming on. You've been fascinating as always, and I just want to appreciate you taking your time.
Oh, sure. Thanks for having me. Hey, you too.